One of my favourite summer crops is the tomato. Here, growing on a bed outside in my garden, trained as single stem cordons. They've produced wonderful crops this year, and in this video I'm going to describe how I sow and grow them from seed sown earlier in the year. Let's start with varieties. Now, I live in the East Midlands in the UK, and I've grown many different varieties of tomatoes outside over the past 30 years. As when growing anything on the veg plot, some years are better than others. But several years ago, there was one summer in particular when I went full out growing some lovely Italian seed varieties with plum tomatoes like Roma and San Marzano and many others. It was a hot summer, but the weather turned quite humid, and these are perfect conditions for a fungus disease called blight to develop that loves warm, humid conditions. Now, blight can attack both tomatoes and potatoes. It's caused by a fungus called Phytophthora infestans. And yes, this is the devastating disease that attacked potato crops in Ireland between 1845 and 1851, leading to the Irish potato famine and leading to about 1 million deaths. Well, in the hot summer I mentioned, my outdoor tomatoes were growing beautifully, and by August the plants had grown to quite a size and were carrying an incredible crop until disaster struck and blight disease started spreading on my plants. The leaves and shoot tips started turning black and dying back, and the fruits developed horrible patches across them. Bit by bit, the blight killed off all my tomato plants, with diseased fruits falling to the ground before I could pick them, and I lost the whole crop. This was a turning point in my choice of tomato varieties to grow outside. From that day on, I decided to only grow tomatoes that had been bred with good natural resistance to blight disease, and avoid the temptation of seed catalogues showing wonderful looking tomatoes, heritage varieties and old Italian crops. They possibly grow perfectly in Italy and other countries, but they're not for me. Why waste the time and cost of sowing, planting and training these tempting outdoor varieties only to lose the lot to disease? So what's my answer? For me, it's Mountain Magic. This variety was bred by Dr. Randy Gardner at North Carolina Agricultural Research Service, and as it was trialled at the Mountain Research Station, it was called Mountain Magic. Randy was affectionately called the Tomato King, as he developed over 20 tomato cultivars over his 30-year career. It's a cordon or indeterminate variety, not a bush tomato, and the original research documents praised its high resistance to late blight, moderate resistance to early blight, and it was described as fairly compact, although outdoors my plants grow to about 4 or 5 foot in height or more during a good growing season. Its round red fruits have an average weight of around 2 ounces. They have a good resistance to cracking, a sweet flavour that comes from its grape tomato parentage, and a really long shelf life, so it stores well after picking. In fact, over 3 years of breeding trials, Mountain Magic was rated as having a far better flavour than many popular heirloom varieties in America like Cherokee Purple and Red Brandywine, Mr. Stripey and others. Plus, it stayed free from blight, while these others succumbed to the disease. It's also resistant to several other tomato diseases, including fusarium wilt and verticillium wilt. And Mountain Magic is versatile too, lovely in salads and sandwiches, ideal for cooking tomato sauces and soups. Back in 2014, one of the first truly blight-resistant varieties to be introduced was Crimson Crush. This was developed with the help of the renowned plant breeder Simon Crawford, who many years ago developed a lovely bush tomato called Red Alert. Now, Crimson Crush is an indeterminate variety too, which means you grow a single stem cordon and pinch out any side shoots that form. Simon and his associates also cleverly bred this variety to include 2 different disease-resistant genes that gave Crimson Crush excellent resistance to common strains of blight disease, not unlike Mountain Magic. Now, I tried growing Crimson Crush alongside Mountain Magic in my own garden, and for me it did produce good yields, but it lacked the flavour. So it's certainly worth considering, but I do prefer Mountain Magic. There are other blight resistant varieties of tomato available too, so you can consider some of these. Crimson Cherry, a lovely sweet cherry tomato with a bit of a tangy flavour, good for growing outside or under glass as a cordon, and it can be grown in the ground or in large pots. Crimson Plum, similar to meaty outdoor plum tomatoes like Roma, to cook and preserve. It should start ripening from July and continue cropping well into autumn. There's Lozetto, a cherry tomato with a cascading bush habit, good for patio pots and tubs where it produces abundant crops if kept well watered and regularly fed with a high potash tomato fertiliser. Lizano is a vigorous trailing bush cherry tomato, great for baskets and containers with a lovely sweet flavour. And there are new tomatoes coming along regularly, so do keep an eye out in the seed catalogues for any varieties which offer really good disease resistance. There are a wide range of flowers, vegetables and herbs that we can grow at home every year, and many of them can be grown from seed. Now, when you're growing from seed, you can sow in a number of ways. You can use a windowsill, you can use a greenhouse like I've got here, maybe with a heated propagator if you're sowing very early in the year. And you can sow seeds into either pots. Small pots are great. You can sow seeds individually, or you might sow a number of seeds together in a larger pot. Or you can use what are called modular seed trays, which is a seed tray which has got lots of individual modules in, fill it with compost and sow seeds in those. But today I'm going to use a slightly different technique. I'm going to sow my seeds into little coir pots. Now, these fibre pots come as compressed pellets like this, and all you have to do is soak them in water to make them increase in size. You just get the pellets themselves, put them in a tray, add some water in the bottom of it, and within 30 minutes or an hour the pellets have soaked up in size. They've reached this sort of size, and then you can sow the seeds individually into them. Now, when you sow into these little pots, you'll get a little seedling or group of seedlings. These are some calendulas. I sowed 2 seeds in each coir pot, and you can see I've got a nice little clump of seedlings to plant straight into the garden. Or you can use it for growing crops, tomatoes, all sorts of other things. And these little tomato plants have been growing for a few weeks now, and look, the seed germinated, and I've got a beautifully strong tomato plant here to pot up individually and grow on to give me summer crops either in the greenhouse or out in the garden. You can just leave these modules overnight to absorb moisture, and once they're up to this lovely full size, just make a little dimple in the top of each of these modules. That's where we're going to put the seeds. You just need to make a little bit of a dimple in the top. Then I can get my seeds, and I'm sowing a tomato here called Gardener's Delight, and I literally have to pop 1 seed into the top of each module. Now, if your seeds are very affordable, you could put 2 seeds in each module. Cover up the top. What you can do once you've sown the seeds is to put the seeds on a windowsill or in a propagator, somewhere warm. What they need is warmth. The blocks themselves are moist, and we're just going to water them a little bit every day just to keep those blocks moist. The seed needs moisture, it needs warmth, and then the seedling will germinate. Once it's germinated, of course, it needs good light as well. Now, After about perhaps 10 days or 2 weeks, those seeds will have germinated. And here's some I sowed a couple of weeks ago, and you can see these have germinated into beautiful little tomato seedlings. I can already see the roots growing out of the bottom of these coir fibre modules. I put 2 seeds in this little module, so what I could do now I know both seeds are germinated, I can remove one of the seedlings. That was just basically my little guarantee, my safety measure. I didn't want to waste time sowing one seed and then it didn't germinate and then you've wasted 2 or 3 weeks. So now I know both have germinated, I can literally whip that seedling out. I don't need it, throw it away, and that little tomato seedling I will grow on over the next few months, planted in the greenhouse or outside if you've got an outdoor tomato variety, to grow crops this summer. And these little tomato plants have been growing for a few weeks now, and look, the seed germinated and I've got a beautifully strong tomato plant here to pot up individually and grow on to give me summer crops either in the greenhouse or out in the garden. Now you'll see little roots growing out through the sides of the coir pot, which means they're ready for potting up into probably a 3, maybe a 4-inch pot. Use a multi-purpose peat-free compost, layer of compost in the bottom of the pot, then fill in around with more compost. You can bury the base of the stem of the tomato, that's absolutely fine. It will send out roots into the compost from there, but keep those seed leaves just proud of the soil surface. Firm well with your fingers, and then you can water it in well. And just repeat that for all the rest of your tomato plants. A good multi-purpose compost is essential. Layer in the bottom of the pot, just 1 inch or so, then pop in the little tomato plant which is raised in your coir pot. Put that down, firm it in the centre of the pot itself, filling around with more compost. And this will grow on, and this is all you really need to do to grow the plant on. Once it's filled that pot with roots, you can plant it up or plant it out in the garden. Firm well, water. Now I keep these in the greenhouse and grow these on for a few more weeks until they're ready to plant out. Now I have to say, just going back to seed sowing for a minute, that I find sowing tomato seeds in little coir pots is a really easy, simple, foolproof way of raising plants and avoids what is called pricking out. But let's cover the traditional way of sowing seeds for a minute. If you want, you can get some small pots, maybe a 3-inch pot, fill it with a seed sowing compost. Fill it right up to the top and then level the surface of the compost. And then you can put a little layer of tomato seeds over the top. Not one seed in each pot, but put perhaps 6, 7, 8 seeds over the surface of the compost. Just tap them down gently, then cover the seeds lightly. Now if you want, you can cover the seeds with the seed sowing compost, but I like using vermiculite. It's a dry material, you'll buy it in bags from your garden centre, and it's very easy to cover small seeds thinly, just with a very thin layer. So cover the seeds with the vermiculite and then water. I start by watering from the top, and you'll notice that the vermiculite turns a deeper colour, but then you can rest the pots in a tray of water and let the compost soak up as much moisture as it needs. If you want, you can stand the pot in water from the beginning, and once the water has soaked up to the top of the pot, you'll notice the vermiculite turning a deeper colour. Then I cover the pot with some clear kitchen film. This is just to conserve moisture and stop the surface layer of the compost from drying out. Putting the pots in a propagator could do the similar job, and also you could just put a piece of polythene or glass over the top of the pots, but I find that covering each pot individually with this plastic wrapper is an ideal way. And you can keep an eye on the pots every day, and as soon as you notice the first signs of a seed germinating, you can take this layer of plastic away. Place these in a warm place. A warm windowsill would do, but I've got a heated propagator that I can set to a temperature of about 21 degrees, and that will encourage good seed germination. Usually within 7 to 14 days the seeds will germinate. Then remove the plastic from the top of the pot. Leave those seedlings to develop, and as soon as each seedling has produced its first true leaves and it's got a good root system, you can gently take the little seedlings from the pots and prick them out and pot them up individually. So tip them out into your hand, then tease apart each seedling gently. Hold the seedling by a leaf or the seed leaf, the cotyledon. Don't hold it by the stem or you might crush and damage the stem. So tease the seedlings apart, take each individual seedling, and then you can pot it up on its own. And this technique is called pricking out. Just put some compost into a small pot. Again, use the seed sowing compost. Big dip down in the centre of the pot and just ease that root system right the way down into the compost. Put more compost around the little seedling, and it doesn't matter if you just bury the base of the stem, as long as you keep the seed leaves just above the surface of the compost. Water from above, letting the water seep down through the compost, and leave the pots in a tray so that you can water them from below and top up the water as necessary. Then I put the little pots back in my heated propagator so they'll develop, and you can leave these to grow on until the root system has filled the little pot, and then they'll be ready to pot on into a slightly larger container. Just one other point to add is that compost itself contains very little nutrient. Usually a seed sowing or a potting compost will have enough feed in it probably to keep those seedlings going for 5 or 6 weeks, and then you'll need to feed individually. So keep an eye on the colour of the leaf itself. If they start going pale, then you'll know that the seedlings need some more food. So start feeding the seedlings to encourage them to put on good, strong new growth. The young plants will need some support as they grow, so get a cane and push it down into the pot close to the main stem, and then just use some garden string to tie the stem as it develops right up to the top of the cane. Just gives it more support, stops it getting weak and bending over and breaking. Now let's prepare the bed for planting out my crop. Tomatoes are a tender crop, so they shouldn't be planted outside until the weather conditions are warm enough and there's no risk of a night frost. In my area this is around about the middle to the end of May, but if you're in a cold area you might want to wait until early June. I choose a sunny, open site for growing my tomatoes. A sunny position ensures good, strong growth and also excellent fruit ripening, developing lovely sweet fruits. A little dappled shade for part of the day probably wouldn't affect cropping, but the sunnier the site, the better the crop. It's also worth forking some manure or soil conditioner or homemade compost into the ground before planting. I'm a keen advocate of feeding the soil, which in turn nourishes the crops that are growing in it. Fork the compost in well, and then rake the area to settle the soil and level over the site, removing any weeds you find or any large stones. Now I put my plant supports in place, and for this I use these robust metal spirals that simply push down into the ground so the spiral stands vertically upright to give the growing tomato stems about 4 to 5 foot of support. Bamboo canes wouldn't really be strong enough and would bend and possibly break when the crop is developing, so instead I use these metal ones, but you could get some stout wooden posts and hammer these into the ground instead. For me these metal spiral supports are ideal, and I've had mine for many years and reused them again and again, so they'll last for ages. Push the base of the metal pole into the ground. It should go down at least a foot or so to ensure it stays upright and supports the tall plants which are carrying a heavy crop of fruit. In terms of spacing, I think they need to be about 2.5 to 3 foot apart, and wider spacing gives each plant more space to grow and develop, so if you've got the space, do be generous. Next comes planting. I grow my plants from seed in a greenhouse, but you might be able to buy blight resistant tomatoes at your local nursery or garden centre. By mid-May, my plants are well established in their small pots with a really good root system. They're perfect for planting out. I usually wait until the first flower trusses have formed, and sometimes wait for the very first tiny tomatoes to have started forming. This just ensures that once planted out, the tomato will have already begun forming fruits, rather than just put its energy into producing lots of leafy growth instead of starting to develop flowers. One tomato is planted next to each metal spiral support, so dig out a deep hole to settle the root ball of the tomato down into. Make sure the soil in the base of the hole is well broken up, and you can even fork in a few handfuls of compost to lock in moisture for new roots to grow into if you want to. You can plant tomatoes quite deeply, so soil actually buries the bottom inch or two at the base of their stem. Roots will grow out from this buried section of stem over time. Mountain Magic it's called an indeterminate type of tomato, which means they've grown or trained as a single stemmed cordon, not as a multi-stemmed bush. So starting at the bottom, gently wind the main stem of the tomato up the spiral metal support. You'll need to tweak them a little as you go to avoid damaging or squashing the leaves or flower trusses growing out at intervals from the main stem. Deep planting also means the root ball of the tomato plant is well down in the cultivated soil, so new roots will develop outwards and downwards from here, away from the soil surface, that can quickly dry out in a hot, dry summer day. To ensure plants establish quickly, I make a mound of soil around the plant to create a little moat. Then you can simply pour water into the moat, and it will sink down into the soil around the stem of the plant, into the root zone below. This moat helps direct water into this area towards the plant. So keep watering in this way for a few weeks until the plants are really established. From then on, perhaps a couple of times a week or so, check each plant and just wind in new growth at the top of the stem. It should hold in place on its own, and the leaves usually hook around the spiral to secure the stem. But if it looks loose or it starts to unwind, then just tie in gently with some garden string. Companion plants are also an important part of my vegetable garden. On my plot, I don't just grow tomatoes and vegetables, but include a few flowers too, like planting French marigolds alongside my tomatoes. This is called companion planting because it has a number of benefits, particularly in helping keeping crops free from pests. The strong smell that comes from the foliage of French marigolds can help mask the smell of the crops they're growing alongside, making it harder for pests that are attracted by smell to find them. And why not plant pots of French marigolds alongside crops in your greenhouse, where the strong pungent aroma from their leaves helps deter whitefly pests from infecting your tomatoes, chilies and cucumbers. You can choose summer bedding, annuals and other flowers with single open blooms to grow on your plot, as they'll attract hoverflies to feed from the flowers. The adult hoverfly feeds on pollen and nectar, and then they'll breed and they'll lay their eggs on your crops, where the developing larvae will feed on the aphids, the green fly and black fly pests, keeping their populations down without you needing to spray. This is companion planting in action. While adult hoverflies are very visible, flitting from flower to flower, you'll have to look carefully around your plots to find their larvae. I was lucky to spot this hoverfly larvae alongside a ladybird larvae on the underside of a plum leaf, both feeding on aphids. A lovely sight and great to see natural pest control in action, demonstrating that organic gardening does bring its benefits. The important lesson here is to avoid using pesticides, even if you find a few green fly on your crops, as these are the food for beneficial insects like hoverfly larvae, lacewings and ladybird larvae. Nasturtiums are a good companion plant, as their flowers and leaves can be added to salads to add colour and a warming, peppery flavour. I let hardy annuals like the poached egg flower, Limnanthes douglasii, self-seed around my plot, plus flowers like cosmos. They can be left to self-seed too. And I also let crops grow to seed. Things like rocket, I let it run to seed, to flower, and the flowers will attract hoverflies and bees. You can then collect the seed and simply scatter it around, let it germinate to fill in gaps around your plot. Try growing herbs as companion plants too, like chives, both the normal ones and the garlic chives with their flattened leaves that taste a little bit like garlic, or basil, mint and many others. Their aromatic leaves help deter pests, and the flowers bring in bees and beneficial insects too. Now, for good healthy growth, good flowering and fruiting, don't just rely on the nutrients in the soil of your garden. Give them some extra fertiliser, and for that I thoroughly recommend a high potash liquid feed. This will be a balanced fertiliser containing lots of different major nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphates, but particularly the potash. High potash encourages good flowering and also good fruiting. Mix it up in a watering can. Give each plant a good feed, perhaps every 7 to 10 days through the summer, and that way you'll be rewarded with bumper crops of fruit. Now, one thing you will have to do is water your crops. If you don't water regularly, then the fruits can start to split. It's due to irregular watering. No water 1 minute means the skin hardens up. Water the next means the fruit swells and the skin can split. The other problem that can develop is something called blossom end rot. It's a sort of brownish patch which develops on the fruit where the blossom attaches to the fruit. It's due to irregular watering, which leads to a lack of calcium, and a lack of calcium means that the cells of the tomato don't form properly and you get these brown patches. So do make sure you water regularly. Now, for my outdoor tomatoes, I tend to plant the plant itself in a little dip or a hollow, or make a little moat of soil around the stem of the plant. Then when I water, I can water inside the moat, and the water gets directed into the root zone of the plant itself. The other thing you can do with outdoor crops is to use a seeping or leaky hose. I run these around my bed of tomatoes so I can plug the hose in one end, turn the tap on, or connect it to a water butt if you want, and as the water flows through the leaking hose, water trickles out onto the soil surface and drips down, soaks down into the soil itself. If you want to reduce evaporation, then cover the leaking hose with a mulch of compost to seal the water in, and that way less water evaporates and more water soaks down into the root zone of the plant itself. As far as care through the summer is concerned, it's worth remembering that cordon trained varieties of tomatoes are trained up as a single stem, and any side shoots that develop from that worth pinching off. Sometimes you can leave 1 or 2 extra ones to develop and get some extra flowers and fruit. Otherwise, just pinch out the side shoots as soon as you spot them, remove them completely, and let the main stem develop up to carry the flowers and the fruit. Keep spiraling them on, training them up on whatever support mechanism you've used. I've got these metal spiral supports, robust ones that won't blow over in the wind. Give them that extra support to make sure that they grow strongly and they don't blow over in the wind. And once the plants have produced 3, 4, even 5 trusses of fruits, I'll literally pinch the tip of the main shoot out. This will be around about September time, because you know that any future flowers that develop are probably unlikely to have time to develop mature fruits. So let the plant put all its energy into the fruit that it's already carrying and just pinch out the tip of the plant completely. So there's a few tips and ideas on growing outdoor tomatoes. Have a go. Grow your own plants from seed, maybe buy some plants from a local garden centre or mail order supplier. Loads of varieties are suitable for growing outdoors in different conditions around the country. So have a go, grow your tomatoes, and hopefully you'll end up with productive crops like I have.